Okay. What is going on YouTube? I am not sure. In the worst, I'm not sure about what is. I think there is a slight delay. Then I will start, folks. And I hope if anybody can just take a look at what is happening. Then, folks, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just, I am hearing an echo. Okay, then welcome to this Slavery Archive book club. If you don't know about what it is, Slavery Archive is a hashtag that I have been using now for a few years to discuss issues related to slavery.
Oops.
Anna, you're muted.
Unmute.
Now you're okay.
Okay. Let me just check. This is going to be a mess, but okay. Here we go. Folks, then welcome again. This is the Slavery Archive Book Club. This is the first session that you are having on Zoom, and also we are broadcasting this on YouTube, and this is why it's a little bit messy because there is a lot to deal with today. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and I am a historian, and this name is Slavery Archive is a hashtag that we have been using on social media, especially Twitter and Facebook now for a number of years. And today then you are going to have this first conversation about our first book that we will discuss in the book club, that is Tacky's Revolt by Vincent Brown. Then Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war. And I will be introducing then Vince, and I will also introduce Jessica Marie Johnson, who is co-hosting this book club, and I hope that she can show up here on for us to welcome her as well. Then I will introduce Jessica and also Vince, and then you are going to start then a short presentation with Vincent about his book. After that, all of you will be able to speak, to ask questions. And the way of doing so, you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on participants. And then there is a way on at the bottom for you to raise your hand. And like this, you unmute yourself and you ask a question. I will ask you then that when you will not be speaking, please mute yourselves, because like this, we don't have the noises that come from your home. Now let me introduce my colleague, Jessica Marie Johnson, who is then a historian and assistant professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. Her work then has appeared in several academic journals, and she is a historian then of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. And she is the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy and Freedom in the Atlantic World, that is going to be out in August, and Jessica is our next guest in the book club. You are going to discuss her book on August 12th. And in addition to that, Jessica, she is the co-editor of a special issue of the Black Scholar that appeared in 2017. And she has some multiple digital projects that she leads then with her website in particular, that is AfricanDiasporaPhD.com. There is a website that has been there for about 10 years or more. And all of us, we know then this website because of it disseminates the scholarship on African diaspora. Jessica is the recipient of several fellowships, and I would like to highlight, because today she received the Johns Hopkins Diversity Leadership Award. And I want to congratulate Jessica for that, because it's a very special day, especially because you are all locked down at this point. Then you are going to be leading this for the fall and hopefully the spring as well. And I invite you already to be here with us. You are going to be leading for the next session in August 12th. Now let's introduce our guest speaker, which I hope I can find him here to highlight his video. And here we go. Then here is Vincent Brown, our guest author. Vincent Brown is Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. And he directs then the History Design Studio and teaches courses in Atlantic history. And then Atlantic history, African diaspora studies, and also history of slavery in the Americas. Vincent Brown, he is the author then of this important book that I don't know if you can see it, if it's flipped or not. Then this is his previous book. That is a very important book, a book that I know that for many of us has been very important. There is The Reaper's Garden, Death, Empowering the Atlantic World, and so on. Then this is a book in the Atlantic World of Atlantic Slavery. Then this is a book that was published in 2008 by Harvard University Press. And the book that we'll be discussing today is this one. That is Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic War, that was just published a few months ago by Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. Then thank you so much, Vincent, for agreeing to join us. And sorry for the technical issues, but you are going to start, and I hope people who are watching us on YouTube are able to hear us. And if you have questions, those of you who are on YouTube will be able to take some of these questions and pass here to Vincent and have answers as well. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Professor Araujo. Can everybody hear me? Sounds like yes. Okay. Really, really happy to be here. I so admire your scholarship, Professor, but also that of Jessica Marie Johnson, your co-host. I'm really looking forward to reading Wicked Flesh for next month. And I'm also looking forward to your book, Slavery in the Age of Memory, which is so important right now as we discuss the landscape of commemoration that relates back to the history of slavery and what we should do about it. It's very timely. I'm glad it's coming out now, and I look forward to the discussions we're going to have about it. I look forward to the impact that book is going to have on the way we think about our landscape. Okay, so I want to speak very briefly about Tacky's Revolt, because this is my first opportunity now to talk about the book with people who will have read it, or at least have read part of it, at least have looked at it. So I don't want to spend too much time introducing it, but I really want to get to your questions and get into the discussion as fast as possible. But I do want to kind of set the tone by talking about the kinds of things that I was trying to do with it. My first book, The Reaper's Garden, was the book that was based on my dissertation. It was largely thematic, and I set out to do something a little bit different with this book, which is to write an analytical narrative, and push the concept of analytical narrative even further than I had with my first book. So what does that mean? It means that what I wanted to do was try to balance three things with this book: the argument, the story, and also the book as an archive itself. Starting with the argument, I wanted to say a couple of very basic fundamental things that would both introduce people to slavery and a way of seeing the history of slavery as I saw it, as I thought was most appropriate to studying the event that I was looking at. I also wanted to make an argument that I thought specialists could learn from. And then I wanted to say something about the sources that I was using. So the three dimensions of that argument were: the first and most simple, the one that I think has really been accepted so far in the reviews that have come forward, is that slavery is war. And in that, I'm really following Laureano Gustavus Vasa, who in his autobiography said that when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And he was in some ways following the philosopher John Locke, who had said, what is slavery itself but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and the conquered. But Locke was actually trying to legitimate slavery. And as many of you know, Locke was an investor in the Royal African Company. He helped to write the Constitution, the fundamental Constitution for the colony of South Carolina as a slave state. And so what he was thinking of was how we could reconcile, himself as the philosopher of freedom with this interest in slavery. Equiano was doing something different. And he was doing something that I think is much more aligned with the way I think as a social rather than an intellectual historian, is he was trying to describe something fundamental about the relations of slavery. And he wasn't just being metaphorical. He had been in Jamaica in the late 1760s, or in 1772, just after the island was reeling from the slave revolt of the 1760s that I write about in the book. So I really want to pick up on Equiano as kind of social theorist of slavery and play out his perspective on slavery as a state of war through the slave revolt in Jamaica in 1760, which was the largest in the 18th century British Empire and the largest in the Caribbean before the Haitian Revolution. I should say also that in some ways, it's not just that Equiano was revising Locke or contradicting Locke, but Equiano was picking up on the same kinds of resources, drawing from the experience of the Glorious Revolution in England, which also impressed people like Milton, right? So the English Revolution and the Glorious Revolution was something that people in the 17th century England thought a lot about, and it tended to shape the way they thought about relations of power. Equiano was citing Milton and particularly the conversation that Milton stages between Beelzebub and God about slaves and their response to being enslaved. So he wasn't citing Locke, even he was picking up on Locke. So what I'm doing is kind of drawing out that context of the English Revolution and setting that as the parameters for the way I think about slavery and slave revolt. So that's the kind of first piece of the argument, which is to see this slave revolt and slavery itself as a state of war. The second part of it is to talk about the concept of what I see as diasporic warfare. And here is something that I think I'm adding to the specialist literature on the African diaspora, on the history of slavery as well, and the history of slave revolt, which is to really think about the migratory movements from Africa to the Americas as being something that was kind of integrated with this larger history of Atlantic warfare. So we know a lot about diaspora and culture. Historians have, since even before the anthropologist Melville Herskovits, been thinking a lot about how diaspora transformed African cultural practices and African cultural orientations into African American cultural orientations. And we've argued about that quite a bit. But what we hadn't spent as much time doing, at least until John Thornton's Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World and James Sweet's Dominguez Alvarez in the Intellectual History of the Atlantic World and other texts, we hadn't spent as much time thinking about how one could integrate African history, African political history, and the transformations happening within West Africa into our understanding of the Americas. And so that's one of the things I think this book can contribute, which is it's a close study of how it is that African history actually mattered in the Americas. And in that, we're of course kind of working against a long tradition, at least since the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, that posited that Africa forms no historical part of the world, right? That what happens in African history is not really important. There is frankly no history of note there, that very little ever changes. And so it's not something that one has to account for when thinking about the history of the Americas. This despite the fact that we know from 1500 to about 1820 or so, more than 3/4 of all the people who populated the Americas were from Africa. And yet we don't really think much about the history that they brought with them, right? About the historical experience. We think a lot, again, about their cultural practices, but less about their historical experiences. I wanted to kind of integrate those historical experiences in how we understand the Americas, specifically through this large slave revolt in Jamaica in 1760 and through the 1760s and beyond. Okay, the final piece of the argument is in this conversation about sources and silencing. And what I wanted to do was show that we can kind of go much further than asserting that the sources on the history of slavery were silent as to the historical experience of the enslaved, and really spend a lot more time thinking about what we could say, less than what we couldn't say. And what I mean by that is, and what I try to show in the book is that there are three ways of reading a source, roughly. One way would be the way that historians are often critiqued for reading sources, as like transparent reflections of what happened. I don't think historians generally read sources that way, but it's a critique that's out there, so let's acknowledge it as a fair one. The other way would be what I would say is kind of more the Edward Saïdian way, right? Which is from Orientalism, sources as representations only of the conventions for representing made by the people, on the part of the people who made those sources. So what you can understand from sources is not what they describe, but you can understand better the worldviews, the thought processes, and the habits of thought of the people making the descriptions. And so we can use the sources on slavery to describe the enslavers themselves. The third way, which is I think a more dialectical way, which is I think what historians have been doing quite a long time, but haven't maybe been as explicit about as we should be, is to read sources as artifacts of encounters between those conventions for representing the world and the world out there that force those conventions to take certain kinds of forms and not others. And the metaphor I use in the book is to say that, as surely as water and air form the shape of rocks, these sources on the history of slavery are shaped by the slaves that they hardly describe, by the actions of those enslaved. And reading them as carefully as possible, situating them in their context, reading the sources themselves as characters that are reacting as much as acting on the world, we can say something. I think we can make some more plausible guesses about just what the enslaved were doing and something about their historical experience. And the test of whether or not I'm successful with that is in the book that you've read, or at least encountered. The second piece of what I was trying to do, obviously, is tell what I thought was going to be a good and introductory story, a narrative account of this event, Tacky's Revolt, situated in the longer arc of the story of slavery as warfare in the 18th century. And in that, I wanted the story to have, as narratives do, spatial, temporal, and logical dimensions, meaning, I had settings, I had agents or characters that I wanted to pay careful attention to. I had a trajectory with turning points, an inner impulse to the story, which was really just, the will of the enslaved to be free and the determined effort of the enslavers to keep them in subjection. I wanted to make sure that my voice was carrying the argument through. And then I also wanted the moral of the story to be something to the effect of the history of slavery is not the same thing, it's not co-equal to the history of Black people. And that, when one understands slavery as an institution, one hasn't fully, or the logic of slavery as an institution, one hasn't fully understood what people do with that institution, how people live with that institution. And so I wanted to kind of make sure that I was emphasizing the history of African-American people, the history of African people, the history of the enslaved, and not just the history of slavery as an institution. And the final piece would be the book as itself an archival document. I was very aware that this is the first book-length history of Tacky's Revolt, which is an incredibly important event in Jamaican history. There's actually a movement on the part of an activist named Derek Black X Robinson, among others, to make Taki a national hero within Jamaica. As I said, it was the largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire. And as I try to show, it had important reverberations and consequences around the Atlantic world and was integrated with other events around the Atlantic world very tightly, inseparable from kind of some of the major episodes of the mid-18th century Atlantic world. And so I wanted to make sure that this was a book that stood the test of time, right? And to do that, I thought that the evidence that I presented should exceed the argument, should in fact exceed the story. Many of the books that I go back to again and again, the books that I like most, are books where I can find something in them that maybe the author didn't really even intend for me to find, that maybe that wasn't the author's main purpose main argument or main, stylistic gesture in telling the story, but something that can animate the kinds of inquiries, arguments, stories that I want to tell later. And I wanted to put in enough information, bring forward enough of the research that I've done really over the last quarter century on Jamaica and the Atlantic world, so that the book was going to be available far past the time when, my argument about slavery as warfare, my argument about the way Tacky's vote was integrated into the Atlantic world, my way of telling the story. I wanted the book to last far past those gestures. I wanted it to be available for use and have some relevance to people who are doing research in the future on questions that I can't predict. So I'll stop there and we can kind of go anywhere you'd like with the discussion.
Let me just go here then, just to be sure that everybody can hear. Then if you want to ask questions, I showed you how you can raise your hands. And meanwhile, I want to ask 2 questions to Vince, and then we can see if others of you have questions as well. My question would be the following. In terms of the tax revolt, how do you relate this problem of Atlantic warfare that you refer to now at the end of your presentation to other slave revolts that occurred in the Americas in contexts that are more or less similar in terms of especially large populations of people who were born in Africa, or at least places where Black populations outnumbered white populations? And this would be one question. The other question would be, in terms of this idea of memorializing the Tacky revolt, if you would have some words to say about that as well, in terms of how much this revolt is today embraced as a symbol of in Jamaica, as something that represents resistance, something like, for example, what we can have in Brazil today regarding Zumbi of Palmares, that is embraced today as a symbol. I ask myself if the Tacky revolt is also has this importance. I also have a question that was sent by Gad Human, but I will ask that one later to give time and space for others to ask questions as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So what I want to address the first question first about kind of how I relate this revolt to other revolts around the Atlantic world that might be similar. The short answer is that I don't. That rather than kind of writing an explicitly comparative history, what I wanted to do was write an event-based narrative and trace out the connections, actual historical connections between these people in this place and their actions and other actions that I can see around the Atlantic world. So it's kind of very much an integrated connective history rather than the kind of comparative histories that we might have done, a generation ago when I was in graduate school. That said, I'm just now finishing an article with Manuel Barcia on African warfare in the Americas. And I can tell you that we see certain kinds of patterns, obviously. What we're both trying to do, and as many of you know from from Barcia's African warfare in Bahia and Cuba, and his books on the 1825 revolt in Matanzas, he also does the same thing, which is linking up developments in late 18th century, early 19th century West Africa with the expulsion, the exile, the capture of enslaved Africans who may have been involved in many of those African events, political events in those wars, to what happens in Brazil and Cuba. And we're doing a kind of much broader article about that, basically laying out a method, which is kind of, let's think much more carefully about how it is that one must read into African history in order to understand the history of the Americas. As I said in my introduction, if we're going to understand the history of these 3/4 of the people who populated the Americas down to the early 19th century, then we should understand something more about their backgrounds, not just their cultural backgrounds, but their historical backgrounds, the kind of experiences they brought with them. And then, kind of tying into my argument about sources, then we can get a better sense of how people were reacting to them, the people who actually made the documents that we have for the history of slavery. I think we'll see the history of enslavement and slavery differently in the Americas when we see those sources as reactions, in part to Africans as bearers of their own history as well. So that's kind of how we model that out. The second question about the commemoration of Tacky's revolt is one that I try to keep at a remove from myself, because what I don't want to do is advocate for a particular kind of commemoration, kind of memorialization in Jamaica. I'm not a Jamaican national. And so, Tacky as a subject of Jamaican national history is not something I feel qualified to talk about, right? To weigh in on. There's a second reason though, which is because often in these kinds of national commemorations, you're looking for an individual that you can make a statue out of, right? And so in the case of Tacky's revolt, we want it to be Tacky. One of the things that I found in my research is that, Tacky's revolt as a name for the events that happened in 1760 and into 1761 really should be put in scare quotes. Tacky's revolt is Edward Long and Brian Edwards, the slaveholders who wrote the first histories of this event in the late 18th century. That's their name for the event. That's who they chose as the leader of the event. I think it's far from clear that Tacky himself was the principal leader of these events, and that it was in fact Tacky's revolt as an entire event. I talk about many other leaders who could have outranked Tacky as strategists. And in fact, Tacky is not the main character of my book, but rather there's another enslaved person, probably from the Gold Coast, named Wager, whose African name was Opongo, who actually kind of runs through the book, at least the first 3-4 chapters of the book, as a much more central character than Tacky. So again, I wouldn't want to impose another alternative figure on Jamaican national commemoration. But the reason I want to kind of stay at a remove from the question of how this revolt should be commemorated is because what I'm trying to do is really kind of lay out in as much detail as I can an interpretation of these events as they happen. The study of how these events should be commemorated, the history of those commemorations, the reason I'm looking forward to your book in a couple of months, is a slightly different subject. And I want to leave that subject in the hands of the people who are actually working on those commemorations. I know that's a dodge, but I think it's a fair one.
Great, and then we have, thank you so much. Then let's see, we have, okay, Liz Covert. Then I want to highlight her video. Let's see, here you are. Hello, nice to see you. Then go ahead, just ask your question.
I really enjoyed reading this book and thinking about the insurgents and the actions in Jamaica in a global context. And I'm curious what happened to those insurgents who Jamaica officials sent away from the island, what their lives were like, why enslaved, why these enslaved people who had been involved in a pretty powerful insurgency would even be of interest to people running plantations elsewhere.
Yeah, so the short answer is they weren't. And the people who exiled and sold them to other planters were passing off what they would have thought of as contraband. They were passing off people who these planters wouldn't have wanted to accept, but they were lying about who they were and what they'd been involved in. But the first part of your question is something I did do a little bit of work on, which was many of these people went to what was then the colony territory of British Honduras, roughly what's now Belize, which was for part of this time under the administration of the Jamaican governor, so they could send them there quite easily. And we know that there was a revolt in British Honduras just 5 years later in 1765. We can speculate, though we can't demonstrate for sure, that some of the people who had been involved in Tacky's revolt were probably involved in this revolt of 1765. I was also able to trace at least a shipload of exiles who'd been condemned in the rebellion to probably Virginia, to Norfolk, Virginia. Now, again, this kind of leads to the second part of your question. I can see so going back a step, during wars, this was happening during the 7 Years' War, and during wars, you had a convoy system. by which merchant ships would leave the island under the convoy of naval ships. Okay, so when the revolt broke out, they stopped the convoy, they delayed it, they withheld it so that these naval ships could help to police the revolt on the island, right? But periodically they sent out a couple of convoys when they thought that the pressure was lightening. And at least one ship is listed on the convoy list of ships that the Royal Navy kept as laden only with Negroes, right? These are people who almost certainly had been condemned in the rebellion. And I was able to trace that ship at least up to Norfolk, Virginia, where it was bound. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you get to the customs list in Norfolk, Virginia, Negroes are not listed on that ship. So what happened? Either they were spirited off the ship and sold unawares to some planters that they could sell on the way to Norfolk, Virginia, or there was a deal between the ship captain and the customs official not to record these people. Because in fact, and we know this from Gregory O'Malley's work, the Virginia and other North American colonies had special duties on Africans who had been enslaved in the Caribbean for just this reason. They feared and really knew that planters in the Caribbean tried to export their troublemakers to the North American colonies. And so what these merchants would have done is to lie about who was aboard the ship, to say they were from someplace else, right? Not to tell them, oh yeah, these guys were just involved in Tacky's revolt. In fact, they're trained soldiers who were just involved in a revolt and uprising and killing their masters in Jamaica. No, that's not how they sold them off in Virginia. But in fact, we know from the Royal Navy that they transported them there. So we can guess, at least, even though we, again, don't know, that they told that story to others. That people in Virginia understood what had happened in Jamaica as part of the history of enslavement in the Americas, right? Which I think then integrates our understanding of Jamaican history into colonial Virginia, which again integrates our understanding of West African history into the history of colonial Virginia in a new way, just by tracing out the movements of these people who brought those stories with them. And in that, I'm just drawing on kind of the pioneering work by Julia Scott in The Common Wind, thinking about the currents of communication among Afro-Americans during the era of slavery. He's writing about the era of the Haitian Revolution, but I think some of those same ideas apply to the era of Tacky's revolt. Oh, a final point is that we also know that some of these people probably went to Saint-Domingue, right, to French Saint-Domingue. And that certainly the stories that they told about what was possible militarily in Jamaica and the dangers of a military uprising in Jamaica is something they must have shared also with the enslaved of Saint-Domingue, right? And we know that in Jamaica, people were telling that story for 40 years, at least. We've got evidence that some brand new migrants in 1807 had learned from people who were already on Jamaica about the revolts that happened in the 1760s, right? 4 decades before. So we know people were passing on that history amongst themselves. I think it's easy, again, to speculate, plausible to surmise that people who also were exiled to Saint-Domingue had the history of Tacky's revolt with them, were passing that on, even on the eve of the Haitian Revolution.
Here we go. We have Jessica now. You can go ahead.
I have a question from the YouTube, actually. So do you want to do Gad's question first, since I feel like he queued up before this one?
No, I think that this is, we don't have anybody raising hands, then you can go ahead with YouTube.
All right, so we have Daniel Dominguez asking a question on YouTube. Is slavery a war everywhere, that is in so-called slave societies, as well as societies with slaves? So a question about how pervasive your concept of slave war is.
Okay, that's great. So, if we take Orlando Patterson's famous definition of slavery as the permanent, violent domination of natively alienated and generally dishonored persons, right? Permanent, violent domination is the key to that equation, right? And everywhere you find slavery, you find force or the threat of force, violence or the threat of violence, crucial to maintaining that relationship of master and slave, crucial to subjecting the will of one person to the will of a putative owner. So in my view, kind of that is always a state of warfare to a degree of some type. Now, the violence as a threat doesn't mean that there's an organized campaign of violence all of the time. What we see in Tacky's revolt, what we see in a place like Jamaica, where 90% of the population is enslaved, is that relationship epitomized. That is not to say that it's the same and kind of and experienced exactly the same way everywhere, but it is to recognize that it's everywhere violent. That violence is a fundamental part of enslavement. And I would say, just to kind of push that a little bit forward, I think that, you know, kind of one of the most important legacies of slavery is not just the exclusion from civil society, not just the kind of, you know, delayed recognition of social or political personhood of the descendants of slaves, of Black people, but anti-Black militarism, right? Of a kind of habit of controlling people's behavior, of keeping them in their place through the exercise of violence or the threat of force, right? Which is why the kind of stigma, bearing the stigma of having been descended from slavery, makes you far more vulnerable to violent attack on the people who would enforce order, on the people who would keep you in your place, even generations afterward, right? That is not to say that it's the same thing, but that is to say that that anti-Black militarism as a practice, right, reproduced over time, is, I think, something that derives from slavery, properly seen as a state of war.
Okay, we have another question by Randy Brown, which is now, okay, go ahead.
Hey, Randy.
Hey, Vince, good to see you here. Am I
Good to see you.
unmuted? Can everybody hear me? You hear me?
Yes.
Great. Wow, there's so much to think with in this book. I've been reading and rereading it, but I want to ask you a question about gender that ties back to a couple of your initial comments about the naming of the revolt and the issue of sources you talked about. And so the question is this: I wonder if you can say something about how the revolt's naming, right? It's kind of crystallized as Tacky's revolt, and the assumptions, right, in the sources, the major sources for the revolt, Edward Long, right, about who the leaders of a revolt were, about who was capable of violent insurrection, might in some ways blind us to the roles, the multiple roles of African and African descended women in Jamaica. And end up characterizing this event as fundamentally a kind of masculine event, right, where they're male soldiers who are doing this. We know, though, from your work, right, that there are women who are involved in this rebellion, right? I'm thinking Akua, I think, or Mary, right, the Queen of Kingston, as she's dubbed. And so I wonder if you could say something about the challenges of trying to understand the multiple experiences of women based on the sources that we have for Tacky's revolt, right? Largely created by men. I'm thinking how this might compare to like Aisha Finch's work, right, on La Escalera, right, where she's insistent about women's roles as central, or is it maybe more similar to what Marielene Kars has found in Berbice, where women are dodging, right, to use her term, the rebellion. So I'll be quiet there and welcome anything you're able to.
So it's a great question. I don't think I'll be able to give you a very satisfying answer, but I can kind of walk you through how I wrestled with that question myself, if that helps. So obviously, yeah, the sources kind of characterize this mostly as a masculine event, right? And that is because, and this goes back to what I was saying at the outset, their conventions for representing warfare is primarily as a masculine exercise, with kind of women always being exceptions, right? And sometimes notable exceptions, but they're always kind of singled out as exceptions. Of course, when you look through the history of warfare, you find these exceptions everywhere you look, right? So why is it still an exception in the sources, okay? So kind of that's one thing, is that you're already working with the limitations of the view of these people who are writing about the revolt. But as you indicated, you know, I found that we talked about the Royal Navy and their lists, right? One of the great things about a kind of military bureaucracy is they got to write everything down, right? So anytime somebody comes aboard a Royal Navy ship, they generally take the names of those people who are captured. Now, in the initial phase of the revolt in St. Mary Parish, when it's only the militia that's fighting these rebels, the militia is kind of vastly outnumbered by the enslaved population. So if and when they capture rebels, what they do is they bring them to the coast and then they try to put them aboard a warship, right, where they're imprisoned. So the first 25 rebels captured in that first part of the outbreak of Tacky's revolt are put aboard a Royal Navy warship and their names are taken down by the lieutenant. And you actually see in a couple of different, there are a couple of lists of names. And they vary a little bit. Some people say there are 25 people taken in, some people say there are 23. But in each case, 40% of those people have what are identifiably women gendered names, right? Female gendered names. And 40% is about the percentage of the population, the enslaved population, that is women. So even if I cannot tell you exactly what they were doing in that revolt, I can tell you 40%, I can tell you proportional to their percentage of the population, those women are involved in the very first phase of the largest slave rebellion in the 18th century British Empire. At the very least, I think that we have to rethink our common assumption that kind of women are involved in some other kind of resistance, right? Whether it's purely within the domestic sphere or whether it's dodging. I think the person who helps us think about this best is Thavolia Glimpf and her work on, actual women soldiers in the Civil War who are fighting. Again, we know in other places throughout, of course, there's the famous example of Queen Nanny, there's Afua and Kingston. So we know we find these various kind of women. I think that it's time to rethink our assumptions about women as soldiers in these kinds of campaigns. Walter Rucker has written what I think is a very important book called Gold Coast Diaspora, in which he says that's a transformation. You see women kind of much more active in war fighting in the Caribbean than you see them on the Gold Coast, you see in West Africa. And so I think we kind of need more work on that, but it requires us, again, finding sources that can move us beyond the perspective of the people who are writing these histories in the 18th century. Again, Edward Long and Brian Edwards and most of the letter writers, the correspondents between Jamaica and the UK are not telling us anything that would suggest that 40% of those first rebels captured would be women. That's something that a bureaucrat, not a bureaucrat, but that's something that a clerk aboard a Royal Navy warship tells us. That's not something that's told to us by the self-conscious sources. So again, it's, I think that Aisha Finch's work is fantastic on this. Marlene Carr's work is excellent. But I also think that Thavolia Glimpf's work on women soldiers is going to be the kind of key for us to think our way back into this question.
Okay,
Thanks.
we have, thank you so much. Then you have now Diana Patton. Let's see her. Here we go.
Hello.
Hi, Di.
Thanks, Vince. It's great to be in this room, this virtual room with so many wonderful historians, and you especially. I loved what you had to say about archives and sources, and I think that's really important what you said then. But my question is about something else you said when you were talking about Africa and how we understand Africa in these stories. You said, I think you said it a couple of times, we need to understand not just the culture or their culture, but also their historical background of the actors you're looking at. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the distinction you're drawing there between culture and historical background, or culture and history.
Yeah.
Where's the boundary?
Okay, so good. So this kind of goes back to kind of early on in graduate school when I became kind of both interested in the work that became The Reaper's Garden, but also interested in the anthropologist Melville J. Herskovits. And the kind of debate about the transformation of African culture in the Americas. And most of you know, at least a lot of you know, that when Herskovits began working in the late 1920s, people assumed, the consensus was that the slave trade and slavery had denuded Black people, Negroes, of any ancestral heritage they might have had from Africa. And Herskovits, kind of drawing on the work of W. Du Bois and others, set out to demonstrate that that was not the case. Raced around between different parts of West Africa, the Caribbean, was in Brazil for a long time, collected material from the Southern United States to try and document formal cultural connections between Africans and African Americans, so that he could show a history of cultural transformation, but so that he could also show that there was a heritage from Africa. And this was primarily a cultural heritage. So in his major work, The Myth of the Negro Past, published in 1941, that was what it was about. It was about the cultural inheritance, the kind of cultural practices, worldviews, material culture of Africans that they brought with them to the Americas. And then, of course, kind of that debate was engaged by Sidney Mintz and Richard Price in their book, The Birth of the African-American Culture, where they argued that one needed to think much more carefully about the institutional frameworks within which cultural practice transformed and developed, which I think made our understanding of culture far more material, and appropriately so. We can get into whether or not their characterization of these Africans as crowds rather than groups, and I know that there's been a lot of work on that. We can debate that, but I do think that what they added to the conversation was a much more kind of materialist understanding of how it is that culture transforms in its institutional settings, which I thought was very important. Okay, again, most of that was about, dance, music, religion in the case of Robert Farris Thompson and others, or even in the case of James Sweet, in James Sweet's first book. What I wanted to think about was the things that I was drawing from John Thornton and James Sweet's second book, which is, and Manuel Barcia as well, which is how does one kind of look at transformations in African political history, and in this case, social and military history as well, and see how those play out in the Americas, even at the time. And that's the distinction I'm drawing. That's the thing that I think that we didn't understand quite as well. With John Thornton, we understood the assertion that Africa was crucial. Africa and its history were crucial in the making of the Atlantic world, the making of the Americas. But I don't think, and here thinking along with Vincent Price, that we had a very nuanced and careful sense of exactly how that happened, right? Of exactly how, say, an African soldier might have been captured on the Gold Coast, moved to Jamaica during the slave trade, found themselves in various institutional locations in Jamaica. In the case of one of the principal figures of this book, the man named Wager, who was a military official in West Africa. Then he was a sailor aboard a Royal Navy warship. Then he was a driver on that Royal Navy warship captain's sugar plantation. And then he became one of the principal leaders of this largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire. Now, simply understanding his African experience doesn't tell us all about how those various institutional locations then transform what he sees as the horizon of possibility within which he acts, right? So I was trying to kind of really just say, let's go beyond this assertion that Africa and African history matters and really show how it matters, how it plays out, right, over space and time. And that's why location became so central to this book, why I spent so much time with geography, thinking about exactly how it is that when people find themselves in particular places at particular times, they find that they can do certain kinds of things with their past and with their past experience, right? When I'm on a Royal Navy ship, when I'm on a Royal Navy ship at war, right? I'm drawing on my past in a different way than when I'm a driver on a sugar plantation, and then when I am a slave rebel. And I wanted to kind of show how African experience was in fact coeval, not just anterior to the Americas, right?
Okay, we have a question now by Christina Mobley. Go ahead, Christina. Nice to see you.
Hi, Vince. It's great to see you. It's great to see everyone. Obviously, I love the book. Congratulations. I think you did what it's worth, right? Which is not much. I think you did a wonderful job of integrating the African history in a meaningful way that is not sort of static culture, but that really gives positive agency in specific ways that you can then trace to specific local politics of slavery in Jamaica. And I think you do that in a really beautiful and inspiring way.
Oh, you see me. Thank you.
Yeah, back in grad school, right? This is like our seminar years ago. So I have two questions. One you probably can't answer, but I would love if you would. And that is about these Jamaicans, the enslaved from Jamaica who end up in the southern peninsula of Saint-Domingue, because Dom Pedro was planning a revolt in 1768, which is the same time when in that southern peninsula where the enslaved have been deported after Tacky's revolt, and there is another major Maroon leader in the southern peninsula decades earlier, Plymouth. So there is this real awareness of the enslaved who come from Jamaica are, they are dangerous and you need to look out for them, and they're major maroon leaders. And in fact, the area is called Plymouth after him because that was his name. So Dom Ped is in the same area, 1768. He is planning a revolt. Same time, the Creole planters are also revolting. And this is right after the 7 Years' War, right? And the imperial powers trying to come back in. So if you had any light to shed on that, I'd really appreciate it so I can get this book out. But my question really is about how you use the landscapes, right? Because when you go beyond what colonists could see, when you go beyond the colonial gaze, you do such a beautiful job of using the mountains, of using the topography, of using the ecotones, of tying that back to the experience of where people came from in Africa, of the skill sets that they had, of what was possible for them that was not necessarily possible for colonists. Mm-hmm. And so if you could talk a little bit about that methodology, and especially how you came up with these beautiful maps. Did you actually walk the terrain yourself? Did you use topographical maps or satellite maps? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. So, as you said, I can't answer the question about Dom Pedro, but that's music to my ears. I kind of love the fact, and I think I would expect that, but I didn't do much research on any exiles that moved from Jamaica to Saint-Domingue in the 1760s. In part because any of them that would have gone there would have been smuggled. And so, looking for those records would have been really difficult. But I think if you're starting from the Saint-Domingue sources, you might find more. I never went to Aix-en-Provence for this book. So you might find kind of much more than I was able to find. I will go back and say, yes, kind of everybody knew what was going on because this was fundamentally part of the 7 Years' War. And in fact, one of the things that I'm trying to say is this was one of the major battles of the 7 Years' War. And people at the time knew it, even if historians of the 7 Years' War, like Fred Anderson, have largely kind of ignored Tacky's revolt. You couldn't afford to if you were a sailor or a soldier or a Marine who fought in Senegal, then fought in Guadeloupe, then went directly to Jamaica to suppress Tacky's revolt, or the person who was second or third in command to Wolfe at Quebec, who was then in command of the Jamaica station during Tacky's revolt. This is fundamentally part of the 7 Years' War. And I talked about those kind of first 25 rebels who were captured. So what happened was those rebels were transferred around the island to Kingston and then to Spanish Town for torture and trial. And that is where the kind of first news accounts of what happened in the revolt began to really come out. Kind of they're gleaned from the confessions of those tortured rebels among those first 25 who were captured and brought around the island. Before they came to Kingston, though, when they were aboard that Royal Navy warship, they saw a flag in the distance, gave chase, and captured a French ship. And they took those French prisoners aboard. And those French prisoners shared the hold with those 25 rebels on their way around to Kingston. They went to a different holding cell and had a different fate, obviously. But at least during those several days, those couple of days, when they were in the hold together, if anybody had thought that they were part of a different campaign or that this Tacky's revolt was not part of the 7 Years' War before that, they certainly did at that point, right? The question would be, and you can find those names, I can send them to you, where did those sailors go, right, after they were released? When they went back to Saint-Domingue? Could you trace them back, right? That's where I would start. I do think that kind of if you haven't spent any time with Royal Navy records or with French naval records, they're very good in terms of being able to document people in particular places at particular times. And like I said, once I had committed to writing this book as a narrative, those sources became even more important because I knew I wanted to locate things in place and time and actually trace people around the world in a much more concrete way. I mean, these naval logs will tell you the weather twice a day. So kind of when I wanted to write, it was a dark and stormy night, I could footnote that, which made me very happy as a writer. So anyway, there's that. The second question is of landscape. I mean, I probably could have done a better job had I just walked the trajectory of this revolt, right? Come from start to finish once I knew. But instead, I actually did depend on maps, topographical maps, but also period maps, and just spent a lot of time thinking about kind of, what I knew about where people went moment by moment, who they were in contact with at what place, at what time. And as I began to kind of write again, kind of narratively about the trajectory of this revolt across the landscape, it became very clear that the landscape was not just a setting, but a major causal force in the shape of the revolt. Now, I think this is something that historians used to know back when history and geography were twin disciplines in the mid 20th century, but geography kind of since, at least in the United States, kind of since faded out of the historical discipline. Geography departments started to disappear in the country, so that there are only a few major geography departments like Berkeley and Wisconsin in the country. So it's something we have to recover. And I think you'll remember that when I was kind of really beginning to research this book, I got a grant to take courses in geography and in cartography, and started thinking a lot about maps, how they're composed, thinking a lot about human geography, how it plays out. And that, I think, is one of the things you see in the way I've written this book. It's kind of very much an exercise in spatial history, in geographical history, because of that work. And some of you will know I kind of made a map as one of my first early research exercises, just to try and create a timeline of this revolt. I decided to plot everything I knew about it, all the sources I had about it, on a topographical map from the 18th century, and then watch how the revolt, animate how the revolt would play out over the course of the revolt. And then when I narrated chapters 4 and 5, which is the revolt itself, I was looking at that map and just kind of trying to follow along what I had already done with the animated map.
And then Jessica, you have probably questions from YouTube, then just go ahead.
I do. So I'll do two, because there are a bunch of questions. One is from Thomas Harding, and he asks, what role did rebellions by enslaved people in the West Indies have on British abolition of slavery in 1833? And the second question is from Matthew Spector. Can you comment on the role of the Maroon communities in Jamaica in this period? Specifically, was there ever a chance of free Maroons lending support to the revolts that made up the Coromantee War?
Oh yeah, both great questions. So the abolition of 1833 is a little late for me. What I do is I spend some time thinking about how Taki's revolt shaped the debates over the abolition of the slave trade, which ultimately happened in 1807, but which the conversation about kind of really got heated in the 1780s, just 2 decades after these events in the 1760s. And what I argue there is 2 things. That one, Taki's revolt was an incredibly hard-fought and expensive campaign at the height of the 7 Years' War, at a time when British imperial policymakers were beginning to think that they had been too laissez-faire in their management of the empire. And that if they were going to continue fighting these imperial wars in the Americas, they wanted to A, make the colonies pay more for their own defense, and B, have better administrative control over them. Now, Taki's revolt was in what was at the time Great Britain's most profitable, most militarily significant, and best politically connected colony, right? Taki's revolt was a significant problem for British imperial policymakers. So that when they went to establish their new colonial policy for all of the Americas, right? They had Taki's revolt in mind, as well as what happened during the 7 Years' War in North America. And it turns out, of course, that new administrative policy, those new forms of taxation, are just the things that the North American colonists ultimately revolted against, splitting the First British Empire in 1776. So in that indirect way, Taki's revolt did play a role in the considerations of imperial policymakers, who then foisted the policy on the Americas that provoked the American Revolution, roundabout. The American Revolution, as Chris Brown has taught us, have made the question of slavery a political question in England, an immediate and urgent political question in England in a way that it hadn't been before in the 1780s. Now, if Chris Brown's kind of argument is that the American Revolution is a key catalyst for making slavery a kind of a political subject to be fought over in the meaning and administration of empire, one of the things I don't think he showed us in that book, but that he knows quite well, is that one of the early arguments against the slave trade was that the slave trade made the colonists insecure, in part because they were importing these people who rebelled in the colonies. So you found in 1739, after the Stono Revolt of Africans, most likely from West Central Africa, from Angola, as John Thornton has shown us, a bill passed for a moratorium on the slave trade for 10 years, right, as a security measure. The South Carolinians find they can't do without the slave trade, and so they blow through that. But that was one of the kind of early attempts to limit the slave trade in a slave colony in North America. You find that in Pennsylvania, that it's reports of the unrest in the West Indies that helps to compel legislators there to pass new import duties on Africans, and then ultimately to begin regulating and administering the slave trade. And by 1980, passing some of the first kind of, restrictions with teeth against the slave trade in North America, the North American colonies. You find in Virginia in the late 1760s, again, and early 1770s, Virginian legislators trying to pass special import duties on Africans imported directly from Africa, but those are disallowed by the Board of Trade in London because they're acting more under the influence of British merchants who would like to sell as many slaves through the slave trade as they can to Virginians. Again, this is one of the things you find in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence when he says that the British actually have compelled us to continue the slave trade. There's hypocrisy there, to be sure, and we all recognize that. There's also the recognition that the Virginians had tried to pass these restrictive duties on imported Africans as a security measure, thinking about what had happened in Jamaica in the 1760s, and it had been disallowed by the Crown, right? That's one of the things you're seeing there. So again, early on in discussions over whether or not the British should regulate and then ultimately abolish the slave trade are these really kind of anti-immigrant restrictions, thinking about Africans as a security problem for the colonies. So that's what I'll say about the influence of Tacky's revolt on these early debates over the abolition of the slave trade. The second question is about the Maroons. And certainly, as you know from the book, in 1739, these Maroons who had fought the British to a standstill in the 1730s, compelling Great Britain to sue for peace and sign treaties with them. Those treaties then require the Maroons to police future slave revolts and even capture runaway slaves, which they do. And I think it's pretty clear from my own research that the British might not have been able to suppress Tacky's revolt in the way they did without the participation, without the alliance from the Maroons. At the same time, your particular question was about whether or not there were Maroons who might have allied with Tacky's revolt. And here's where I think I found something rather new. In 1754 and 1755, there was discussion of an island-wide conspiracy that the Maroons were supposed to be a part of. And in 1755, there was a Maroon rebel who the British had been pursuing, who was killed and his head brought to Spanish Town. And there's one letter I found, I haven't really found anything else about it, but one letter said, we actually dodged a bullet because this rebel, Akelpong, was projecting an island-wide conspiracy, right? Now it turns out that Akelpong Town in Western Jamaica was one place that did not send as many troops to aid the British for to suppress that part of Tacky's revolt toward the end. And in fact, one kind of forced march of the rebels went very close to Akelpong Town without being harassed, right? Again, I can only speculate, but I do think that it's highly possible, even plausible, that those people may have been involved in that projected island-wide conspiracy 5 years earlier, that what we see in Tacky's revolt may be in some ways a residue of that earlier planned revolt, and that some of those Maroons simply decided not to police these rebels in 1760 and 61 as they were supposed to do by treaty because they had been earlier involved in a conspiracy against British slavery in the island. So Again, a lot of this is in the realm of plausibility, but I try to show you as many sources as I can to show you that this is the likely scenario.
Okay, we have another question then by Hale Ashby. And let me just spotlight her video. Here we go. You can go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this book. I wanted to follow Dr. Brown's line of questioning on gender. I really appreciated in chapter 2 your framework of martial sentiments and this idea that martial sentiments was the commanding logic of imperial governance and how kind of warfare was enacted on differently gendered bodies. So kind of moving forward to Taki's Revolt, where we understand that 40% of the rebels were in fact women. I was wondering, what does the archive have to say about sexual violence as a tool of colonial warfare, in particular to this revolt? And in what ways were women's bodies utilized as a site of violence and or colonial warfare? And in particular to Black masculinity, you speak both about how it was demeaned, but also hypersexualized. And we see that with Taki, Edward Long, and his sister. So kind of to bring this question together, we see that like throughout your book, gender and sexuality remains a constant thread. So I was just wondering how much about the warfare of slavery is about controlling Black gender and sexuality.
Yeah, so I'm going to come at your question in a kind of roundabout way. I'm going to kind of start broad and hopefully kind of narrow in to really get at it. But first, as I said, seeing slavery as a state of war, for me was to see this revolt as a war within several other wars, right? And that raised the question of scale. So what I'm trying to do in this book is kind of connect the scale of inter-imperial warfare, right, between Britain and France and Spain and Holland and Akwamu and Akim and Ashanti and the Fante Confederacy, right, to these wars between masters and slaves, all the way down to these intimate violent conflicts that were, I think, crucial to the maintenance of dominance, to the exertion of the will of slaveholders upon the bodies of the enslaved. And so in that, like, it became fundamental to see the sexual violence that you see everywhere in the archive, really. I mean, one of the key sources for this is the diary of Thomas Thistlewood, who was an overseer in Jamaica for 36 years from 1750 to 1786, who kept a diary over those decades. And kind of one of the constant features of the diary is his sexual assault, his rape of enslaved Black women. That was crucial to his mastery, to the exertion of his dominance, which was crucial to the state of warfare that was slavery, which was crucial to the maintenance of the British Empire in the Americas, right? So what I was trying to do, kind of almost in a way that, like, Lisa Lowe has taught us when she talks about the intimacy of 4 continents, was to see the intimate violence of that kind of slaveholding on the part of Thistlewood as being connected to this large-scale inter-imperial violence that kind of reshaped the geopolitics of the Atlantic world, to try and see all of those as part of the same story, to see these intimate wars as eddies within larger currents of collective violence that were happening all the way across the Atlantic world. So kind of that's largely what I'm trying to do, and why the kind of the martial masculinity that I talk about is so crucial to the book. Gender is never really a separate subject. I mean, kind of anybody who knows anything about war will kind of tell you how crucial it is to train people in gendered conventions of the exertion of will in order to kill people, right? And in order to kill people, what largely men in history have been trained to do, but also women, is to think about how they can exert their personal capacities, their personal dominance, extend their will in the world, act upon others in the world, right? And acting upon others in the world, exerting their will, forcing themselves upon other people, killing, right, is not so different in kind than sexual violence, right? When people talk about rape as a crime of violence, almost more so than a crime of sex, I think that's what they're saying, right? It's about the exertion of will, right? It's about the demonstration of capacity on the body of another, And in that, kind of killing and rape are similar kinds of exercises. Different, to be sure, but there are similarities there. And that's why in most wars, you find sexual violence as part of war fighting, right, throughout history. And yet, because it's not formally considered part of warfare, right, we often find it written out or underemphasized or not discussed in histories of war. And yet, right, there it is every time you look. And so this book was really trying to set aside some of those formal conventions for writing about warfare and write about warfare as a set of social relationships that was inclusive of the kinds of intimate violence that constitute sexual exploitation, sexual violence, all the way up to, cannon fire aboard a warship, to see those as part of the same story, as opposed to automatically ruling, sexual violence as something separate or separable in the way that I think military historians have often done.
Okay, you are going to move then to Gad, because I know that for you it's later than here. I don't know exactly where you are, but I assume that is later. Then thank you for coming, and go ahead.
Hey, Gad, thanks for staying up.
Hi, Vince. It's greetings from the UK, and hi, everybody. So my question that I thought Anna was going to ask, but of course she didn't, was, and I really enjoyed your book, was something you talked about at the outset when you were introducing it. So you talked about the enslaved in 1807 teaching the story of the 1760s to new African arrivals.
I love that story so much, I put it in both books, Gad.
Yeah. Since I've read both of them, I know that. But anyway, you call it a radical pedagogy of the enslaved. And I found something similar in my own work on Morant Bay, because the rebels there talked about 1831. So then the question is, how do we get at that pedagogy? That's really it really interests me to know. It's like the history of the Africans who brought their own history. How do we get at that history of that radical pedagogy?
Yeah, well, when you find evidence that it was there, you remind people that it was there. Like, I can't recreate the contours of that pedagogy. I don't know the curriculum, right? But I can assert, assert with the evidence that you bring to bear, with the evidence that, as I said, I've put it in 2 books now because I like that source so much. This demonstrates that people are aware of a distinct kind of storytelling in history that is about local circumstances, as well as about kind of who we are as people. So oftentimes we think of these stories as saying something about, people's essential identities, right? Their kind of cultural ways of being, their Africanness, their African-Americanness. We can use their style of storytelling to kind of plot them on a continuum from African to American. We haven't as often thought about the fact that they're drawing inspiration from activities, from a political history that they're teaching and learning to each other. Again, I can't say more than I've said. Believe me, if I could, I would have said everything. I would have made that the entire book. I think Kenneth Bilby is really good in his book, True Born Maroons, about thinking about the kind of contours of what a Maroon oral history looks like, how they remember the first time history. This was something different because I was kind of basing it on the precise details of an event. And it was to say that, clearly people do have some very specific understandings of what was possible in Jamaica in the 1760s, even 40 years later. And even if we don't know exactly what those specific understandings were, we should keep reminding ourselves that there was a different history, that there was a subaltern history being taught and learned there. And keep the question open so that when we go to sources that might show us something, we don't ignore it. I mean, as you know, like oftentimes, you don't have evidence for something until you have a question, right? That would bring it forth, right? We kind of look at sources in new ways all the time because we're asking different questions of them. And until we ask the question about what is the historical worldview? I mean, of course, Richard Price kind of dealt with this in his History of the Maroons, and Kenneth Bilby has picked up on that. But until we're really asking the question, what is it that people, the enslaved, are conveying to each other about this history? It's not until we keep asking that question that we're going to see it in the sources. Otherwise, we might just look right past it.
Okay, let's see. Now we have, okay, let me see who it is here. For some reason, okay, Scott Heerman, I have him, but I cannot spotlight the video. Yes, I can.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, I am still.
Quarantine haircuts.
Your hair looks perfect, Scott.
When doesn't it? Anyway, thank you very much for the book. Thank you also to our co-hosts for putting together this really great event. One of the things I found so interesting about this book was not to think about Tacky's Revolt as a war, but to think about it as 4 wars simultaneously, as you say, a continuation of African Diasporic War, a race war, an inter-imperial war. And one of the things you touch on in the comments and implicitly in the book is that there might be different conceptions of how you fight these wars, different theories of war. Going back to Locke, as you say at the beginning, there'd be biblical wars, there'd be just wars, there'd be imperfect wars, right? Other scholars of other times and places have sort of pushed this analysis forward, work on Nat Turner, for example. I'm wondering if you have a sense for these enslaved individuals. Do they have a conception of how you fight these 4 different wars? Do they have theories of different warfares that they might be engaged in? Because this is not, of course, one event, it's multiple events, and that shapes the course of it as you show so well.
Yeah, it's a great question, and kind of one that I think is totally worthy of research. Not a question I have an answer to, unfortunately. I could only get so far as saying there are lots of people talking about slave resistance as war. You find it in Tacky's Revolt, you find it in Morant Bay, you find it in Ada Ferrer's book, Freedom's Mirror. You find lots of people talking about slave revolt, slave resistance as warfare itself. So kind of that was my cue. You don't find, at least in my research, lots of different kind of theories and strategies about how to fight which kinds of wars. I don't have something that I could call a kind of just war theory. I'm not saying that one couldn't find that. It's just something that I didn't find. Going a little bit further, we also don't find in this period very well-articulated theories of counterinsurgency warfare on the part of the British military. So I kind of wanted to know, look, they're fighting all of these kind of various slave wars. What do they think about it? And there's no codified counterinsurgency strategy for fighting these kinds of wars. They were ad hoc strategies that they kind of had to make up on the spot. There were certainly patterns, but nothing that I can see as, doctrines, right, on the part of military officials, for the British or for the enslaved. So again, I can talk about the patterns, but I can't say any of that rises to the level of theory or doctrine that I can demonstrate. I'm certainly open to the idea that there would have been.
Great. Let me just see if I can go with Ananya. And I cannot show, okay, I needed to show her video. Let's see, spotlight video. Hello, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm trying to not cut my face or head off, but yes, it's very late here. I'm dying of sleep, but at the same time, totally awake.
Thank you for staying.
No, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here and listening to all the fantastic conversation. I had a specific question well, I'll start with a quote on page 207, where you say on the last paragraph, so you talk about the landscapes, which of course are really beautifully imaged through the maps that we talked about as well a while ago. And then you say there you can glimpse Tacky's Revolt, the Westmoreland Uprising, and Simon's March as peaks of an archipelago, running from the tectonic shifts of Gold Coast state making through the volcanic struggles of sugar plantation society. So I thought that was really interesting, particularly in light of also what people are saying about the different wars, that you're talking about. because this idea of the archipelago, I'm working a lot with archipelagic theory at the moment. People are using it in different ways to decontinentalize, deterritorialize emphases, which, you know, would take us back to land masses and obviously a certain kind of approach to history and cultural theory as well, and cultural production when you focus on the land masses. So did you, when you use the word archipelago here towards the end of your book, is it really that, what is the kind of impulse you're trying to perhaps make us come alive to? Is this archipelagic landscape or seascape, aquascape, you know, is it going to, how is it going to then, how can we mobilize that different way of thinking about history to think about histories of land masses, not just Africa, but even Americas, Asia? I mean, is this something we can do with your work?
Yeah, so I will acknowledge that that metaphor didn't come from a deep engagement with archipelagic theory. It's a metaphor for me, but a metaphor that I think draws on the same impulse as the theory that you're engaged with, which is this. Kind of, we need new geographic metaphors to understand how history actually unfolds, because the continental metaphors, the West and East and non-West, doesn't really do it for us. And I can give an example. So several years back, I was teaching a course called American Revolutions in the Atlantic World. And it was about the US and the Haitian Revolution, considered together as a sequence of radical challenges to established imperial authority in the Atlantic world. So we kind of started with the Atlantic world, we kind of went to imperial reforms and reactions, and then we kind of had a final sequence on the American and Haitian revolutions. Okay, I found out later from a student that they were getting credit for their non-Western history credit for that course, right? So this was a non-Western history course. Not because of the American Revolution, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it must be because the Haitian Revolution is non-Western history. But then the Haitian Revolution was kind of very related, you know, integrated with the French Revolution. Before Christy jumps in, Christy Mobley, let me finish, was very integrated with the French Revolution, right? In fact, like, it's only the Haitian Revolution that compelled the French legislators to recognize non-whites under the rights of man and citizen. So that's very much a kind of key touchstone in the history of the West, right? And then, like, we know, of course, that most of those rebels were from Africa, or have been Black people recently born and just born in the colony, one generation in the colony. So kind of, how is it that it's non-Western when it's so integrated with the history of the French Revolution, which is a key event in Western history, right? So how is it that even those Africans are somehow outside of Western history? Confusing to me, right? And confusing because the way we organize historical knowledge relies on these, like, outdated geographical metaphors that don't tell us much about the social geography of history. And so when I write about diasporic warfare, and when I use diaspora as my kind of key framework for organizing how things happen, it's to get away from those, what I think are outdated and no longer useful geographical containers for the way we write about history. And so certainly archipelago is kind of one metaphor that helps me understand that. Diaspora, for me, even better, right? Because then I can write about how, you know, things that may originate in one place travel, transform, take root, and then spread again from another place. It allows motion in the system rather than a kind of static understanding that things happen on land. It allows me to kind of write a social geography that's always in motion and in transformation. And that's why I use the metaphors I do. And that's why, you know, I don't know if this is non-Western history. I hope they get credit for it no matter how they take it, right? But
yeah, no, that's really useful. I think the thing about archipelagos also is that it allows us to spatialize the diaspora in a way that, of course, since you're very keen, I mean, you're telling us you're doing a spatial history, I think that's helpful. And I really enjoy, in a way, the maps work very well, I think, to bring us to this final sentence, which I picked up, not final, well, kind of penultimate ending sentence about the archipelago, because the maps are obviously of not just the island, but bits of the island, except there's one on page 100. There's a plate opposite page 100 where you actually get the entire Caribbean archipelago. But mostly they're parts of the landscape of the islands. And I think that's very interesting because the plates then link up, assemble those bits into an archipelago of their own. So the book, gives us a spatial archipelago in a way, but it's doing its own thing. It's a new archipelago, which you've reassembled for us. So
I used to give talks on this project that were subtitled the Coromantee Archipelago.
Well, there you go. I obviously somewhere, I don't know, this works very well, clearly then. So I'm glad to hear that. But for me, it's a kind of heuristic as well, not just a metaphor. So I think that's why I found it very compelling that you have that sentence, which really organized the whole book in a way that fitted into the way I'm thinking now. But thank you for the book, of course. And I'm really enjoying this discussion. So thanks a lot for the chance to ask the question as well, Anna.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Let's see what Jessica has for us from YouTube. I believe that you have questions.
I do. And I'm just gonna I'm gonna do 3, but hopefully you can smush them into not too much time. All right, so we got Quincy Mills. What was the price of Maroon sovereignty vis-a-vis the world rebels imagined in the process of insurrection? So let me say that with a different pause. What was the price of Maroon sovereignty vis-a-vis the world the rebels imagined in the process of insurrection? The role of Maroons in quelling rebellion is interesting. Second question, Jamie Gamel. Could you talk a little bit more about the idea of sources as encounters? How did enslaved people's African experiences feed into the planters' histories? James Knight, Edward Long, and we talked a little bit about that, but I think people are really interested in how sources and history and methodologies are working together. And Manuel Barcia asked on Twitter, if you could ask Vincent about the use of Western terms and concepts to understand African ideas and practices, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Price of Maroon sovereignty. That's a very complex question, and the answer is still unfolding, frankly. In tensions between kind of Maroons in Jamaica and people who don't identify themselves as Maroons in Jamaica to this day. Again, a kind of different sense of their relationship to the state. Maroons kind of very strongly self-identify as Maroons with a distinct history from the rest of the Jamaican population. And there's an ambivalence, certainly on the part of the majority of Jamaicans, about how they view that history. So of course, Queen Nanny is a national hero, and they celebrate the kind of anti-colonial nature of Maroon resistance. But when it comes to, say, Morant Bay, right? They'll say, the Maroons captured Paul Bogle, right? So kind of they both recognize that, the Maroons played a role in the history of Black liberation in the 18th century, but that role may have been compromised by the winning of their own sovereignty, by the signing of those treaties with the British in 1739 and 1740. Now, I think that it's much more complicated than simply the Maroons fought the British and then they sold out. And that's kind of one way of looking at that. And I kind of very much agree with Kenneth Bilby, who I think is the foremost scholar of the Jamaican Maroons now, that one has to kind of see the Maroons as doing what they had to do to maintain all the kind of very hard fought, tenuous kinds of autonomy and sovereignty that they were able to maintain, right? And that required compromises. And in fact, that always requires compromise. What I'm trying to do with this book is to take Black politics as seriously as possible. And what that means is taking Black politics not only seriously when they're struggling against white people, but also when they're struggling against each other. And that's where the way they self-identify, the way that they form groups, sometimes in opposition to each other, the way they form alliances with different groups of Black people, sometimes with whites, sometimes with others. That's what I want to get at. That's kind of how I understand how these kinds of events play out, right? I don't understand them if I kind of post facto say the only salient categories of difference that need to be understood here are slaveholder and enslaved, white and black, man and woman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have to look at how those kinds of categories of belonging develop in their context, and then how people make solidarities and fellowship and alliances and antagonisms in those contexts if I want to understand how the political activities play out, right? So that's a kind of long-winded way of saying what I'm trying to do in the book is show you how struggles among Black people don't end when they leave Africa, right? And those struggles among Black people have everything to do with how they struggle against enslavement and struggle with white people and struggle with empire. And that I think we kind of need to come to terms with if we're fully going to understand the political history of the enslaved within slavery. The second question was the question between that and Barcia's question about Western terms?
So the second question is about, if you could talk a little bit more about the idea of sources as encounters. Sources. Yeah, and how did enslaved people's African experiences feed into planters' histories? And they named Jamie named James Knight and Edward Long in particular, but.
Yeah, so I mean, let's take Edward Long, which is most people's understanding of this event, of these events, Tacky's Revolt to date has been kind of Edward Long. And there are, you know, mistakes that Edward Long makes in his narrative that are repeated in Michael Creighton's kind of classic article on Tacky's Revolt, and that just kind of go on down the line, because that's our kind of key primary source. When you go back and you look at the context in which Edward Long wrote his history, one of the things you see is the fright and the terror and the uncertainty and the chaos, right? That shaped how planters understood, how they knew about these events as they were unfolding. As I alluded to earlier, a lot of the first things they learned, a lot of the first things in the newspaper, they learned by torturing those first 25 rebels captured and brought around to the island, right? Those are the stories that initially entered the newspaper. Those are the stories that entered the letters from plantation managers to plantation owners back in the UK. Those are the stories that entered into the initial first draft of history that the slaveholders wrote. Those themselves are products of that fear and disorientation, products, in fact, of the slaves' political activity. That's what I mean by these sources or encounters. They're not just describing what happened, they're describing also the disorientation. They're describing the fear. In some ways, I think Tacky's Revolt, as a kind of moniker for the event itself, is a representation of that fear, of that uncertainty, of that disorientation, of the need to name a central figure and identify the entire set of events with this one guy who we can then demonize, right? And pin it all on him, rather than understanding the larger process, which is about imperial capitalism and the slave trade and the ways in which African wars are integrated with European empire. That's all too complicated for them to understand at one point. What they want to do is find the boogeyman, find the ringleader, execute that guy, and we can stop it all, right? I mean, it sounds familiar. We still do that in imperial wars. We still try to find one or two individuals or three individuals that we can identify as the ringleader and not understand the larger process that produces these people, right? So we just exchange kind of one terrorist ringleader for another, on and on and on down the line without ever understanding the underlying processes. Now, what I'm trying to say is those sources themselves are a product of that larger process, which includes that disorientation, which includes that fear, which includes that inability to fully come to terms with the nature of these events. Does that make sense?
Yes. Let's see now what we have.
I think there was one more.
Go ahead. Okay, there is one more. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're going back and forth on this as we write an article, and Professor
so he's cheating.
Professor Barcia is very concerned that that we not take as a given the kind of Western categories for understanding African actions, African events, African movements. I think he's much more deeply steeped in African epistemology than I am. So I'm going to kind of cop to having some limitations on the degree to which I think I can understand things, the way these events played out through African categories. I think Barcia is kind of much more aligned with, say, James Sweet, who has been reminding us again and again and again that the categories we use to understand even things like the Haitian Revolution as revolution may not be the categories that Africans use to understand them. And that maybe kind of those categories internal to African understanding are better terms for us to understand them. I have my, I'm open to those ideas. I have my limitations, which often expressed as doubts about whether or not someone like me, who's kind of trained at US universities and US primary schools and US elementary schools in the English language, can ever fully understand things through, say, Twi terminology and Akan understandings, right? So what I'm trying to do is make the best translations possible from what I can discern about the way people thought about these things into the terms that I conventionally use to communicate with an audience that, again, is primarily trained in the English language in the case of my text, and in the case of the kind of translations that may come, European languages, European habits and conventions of thought. So I think that it's important to understand kind of where we're starting from, but it's also important to understand that we are going to be doing that work of translation. We are not going to remain within those emic categories no matter what we do. That, I think, is kind of an impossibility. And I think that Professor Barcia, Professor Sweet, and I probably have a difference of opinion on that. I'm fully open to being convinced.
Great. We have now Nemata. We are not seeing you. Okay, here you are.
Okay.
Oh, right. Yes. Now go ahead.
Myself. Okay, thanks. So this, I suppose, piggybacks on your last point, Vince, and thank you very much for the book. I really enjoyed it. And it also sort of was a question that came up after Gad's question, because the first thing that those of us who are trained as African historians learn is about the role and the importance of oral history in reconstructing, right, the history of the African past. So it's not surprising, right, that the story of one rebellion would be passed down, right, to another generation in Jamaica. So my question, I suppose, was if you used and how much use you made of oral history and traditions, either for the Jamaican story or for the African side of things. Thank you.
So I'm going to admit to not using much oral history. Oral history to kind of shape my intuition about what was happening. Certainly, HAK, History of the Ashanti Kings, the version that Emmanuel Champong edited. But when I decided that I was going to write, again, a blow-by-blow narrative account with individuals moving between very precise places at very particular times, it became clear that oral history wasn't going to help me do that as much. Oral history was going to, is certainly better in a way at telling you kind of how things matter and why they matter, at the meaning of events. But the tracing of events on timelines and maps is not what oral history does best for you for a period as far back as the mid-18th century. And in your research, it may be different, but I couldn't find oral histories, and even in Kenneth Bilby's oral histories in the Maroons, that could give me the kind of blow-by-blow narrative accounts that I was trying on for this book. Now, I will say, and I'll give a plug to a colleague here, Robert Hansard, if you can see that. This is quite a good book that draws far more on oral history, Identity, Spirit, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, the Gold Coast, and the African Diaspora, in writing about kind of how these events might have figured in Akan worldviews and what they meant to people, right? But again, when he comes to describing kind of how things happen, when they happen over time, he's drawing on the same Western sources that I am. I also think Walter Rucker's book, Gold Coast Diasporas, that I mentioned before, draws a bit on oral history, not quite as much as Hansard's does, but does a very good job of teasing out Akan meanings and worldviews out of this history. But again, it's not so much an event-based history as a kind of larger cultural history of transformation.
I suppose I was thinking about it in the ways that you talk about stories being passed down. Yeah. Right? So they're written, they're not oral in the way that we would interview somebody today, but the idea that even in the documents, their traces of, well, what are Africans telling each other, passing
Oh,
down.
yeah. So again, yeah, I mean, so where I find those, I get very excited because then I can say, this person knew that Africans were telling each other such and such a thing on this date in this place, right? And then I can kind of harness it to my timeline, right? And again, this is not to say that that's the only or the best way to write history. It's to say that I had chosen the timeline and the map as tools for organizing this history. And once I had made that choice, it required certain kinds of limitations on the kinds of source material that's going to best enable me to tell that story in a coherent and consistent way. But yes, you're right. I mean, obviously, like the things that people write down are themselves, and Miles Ogborn's work, a book that just came out that's quite fantastic, is really good at showing how, like, look, this is an oral world. What you see in the written sources are things that have been said, right, first and foremost. And as I alluded to earlier, the first things that people know about this revolt are things that they heard from captured rebels. Those are the things that end up in the newspaper, right? Those are the stories that then get documented, that then we can now date and locate in ways that conventional historians like to. But first and foremost, it all begins with the spoken word.
Great. Let me see. We have Joseph Schmidt.
Thank you so much for your book, and thank you for your time today and sharing with us, and thank you to the organizers. This is just a really wonderful space. I'm going to ask you a question, I think, for the secondary teachers and educators who are here in the classroom. I think one of the really kind of this one silver lining of this greater use of virtual spaces and remote learning is the opportunities for us to kind of jump in and learn from you all and learn with you all. So my question is kind of two parts. Really thinking about kind of what I would describe as the kind of gap in historiography between the secondary teaching world and the university, that I think is almost a generational gap, and that this space can actually help us to get between and bridge that gap. What would you recommend if we were to teach content from your book? Would you recommend that content be? And then the second part is, how would you recommend we teach it?
Oh, wow. Okay. So, I mean, one of the reasons I spent so much time on the maps is I hired a cartographer on retainer, which was a fun exercise. And I said, look, I would like maps, like story maps, that if you didn't read a word of the book, that you could still get a sense of the trajectory of the revolt from the maps themselves. And so that's where we came up with those kind of graphic panels, almost like a graphic novel, where the maps play out the revolt over time. And so there are a good, 4 or 5 animated, not animated in this case, but story maps that show you kind of how the revolt played out. Now, I think what they do is they show you kind of in the conventional terms of military history, something that the conventional military histories never show you, right? How it is that slave rebels move across the landscape, how it is that imperial counterinsurgents police a slave revolt, right? I think that just introducing those maps to students can then kind of introduce them to questions about slave revolt as a military campaign, right? Not just as resistance to slaveholding, but as warfare, right? And then I think, you can pair that with the chapters 4 and 5, which are on the revolt itself, and raise a number of questions about how slave revolt plays out on the landscape. Okay, if you didn't want to kind of get that into the weeds with military history, with the trajectory of the revolt, the course of the revolt itself, just the first chapter, War as Empire, in it, I tried to do a good job, you'll be the judge of it finally, at kind of integrating these different territories of the Atlantic world into one space, to show how the system worked, to show how African history, political history, was integrated with the history of European expansion and slaveholding in the Americas, right? Not the kind of conventional triangle trade, but a real political economic story about how one sees these places as an integrated territory and sees the slave trade itself, sees European colonial expansion itself as the business of war. That first chapter, and I worked very hard on it, is kind of very important for me as a scene setting exercise, but also something that tries to tie together kind of this entire world, which is gonna which is going to set this slave revolt in motion. So if there's one chapter I would introduce, I would give to secondary students to introduce them to the history of slavery, it would be that chapter.
Wonderful. Thank you. We now have Miles Ogborn.
There he is.
Hi there. It's really late here, I must say.
But your ears must have been burning. I was just plugging your book.
Yeah. I'm just staying up, I'm just staying up. So,
thank you.
I think, I mean, what is great about the book is that it's such a great geography book. And that's really, and you're a better geographer than me, and they pay me to do it. But
that's a nice thing to say.
It is a great geography book, and it's really interesting to me how a lot of the questions have come up around that. And I wanted to go back a little bit to some of the things you said about history having, in a sense, got divorced, I think, from geography a bit, yeah. And why that comes back now, and how that came back for you. So it seems from what you said, and I guess from my reading of what you've done in my conversations with you, that comes back through the military history and through the maps, and trying to trace the revolt on the map as a timeline and so on. So in a sense, I was expecting all that from the book, and I'd seen some of those bits before and have worked with the map as well. I guess what I wasn't expecting so much was the ways in which that's really filled out in the book. And I don't know whether I've sort of complained to you about this before, but the term spatial history seems a very thin notion of the relationship between geography and history. And what I got more of a sense from the book was that as a in a sense, a real geography, which has that ecological sense to it, which I think really strongly in the final chapter really has that sense of place and people's action in place. And I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit about, and I was very pleased, I think, to see that I don't think the term spatial history is used in the book. I didn't count the number of times geography is used, but that's the dominant term. I guess I wanted to hear a little bit about that trajectory.
I may have used the term spatial history once or twice. I know I've used it in talks. It may come up in the book, and it's a way, in some ways, of paying tribute to Richard White and Zephyr Frank and people at Stanford who have been reinvigorating the historical discipline kind of through what Richard White has termed spatial history. I'm thinking a lot about geography and cartography kind of in the telling of history. But yeah, I mean, it was never going to be just the maps, in part because I approached geography through the concept of diaspora. And one of the reasons I got so interested in geography and cartography is because I wrote a grant that the argument of the grant was basically, look, I'm a diaspora scholar, and diaspora is fundamentally a spatial phenomena. And yet I have not really been thinking very carefully about the tools, the analytical tools that people use to think about space. And those are the tools that you have as a geographer. Those are the tools that cartographers have. So I kind of wrote a grant to train myself a little bit in analytical geography, human geography, and in cartography. And the first exercise in that training was the map that you saw that's online still. But I always wanted to go further than that and kind of talk about how it is that, you know, the actual movement across different landscapes and different places fundamentally shape the way one should write about diaspora history, right? To make it in some ways kind of less of an abstraction and more kind of a real understanding of how things work, of process. And everything I was trying to do is trying to kind of really materialize the processes rather than abstract the processes into kind of, you know, transhistorical rules, to materialize these processes, to really kind of render them concrete in space and time. And geography helped me to do that. So I'm glad it kind of works for you. If there's anything, I feel like maybe I was over-eager in being so unfamiliar with the discipline and its terms that I probably was naive in ways that I should have been critical, but you know, you'll be able to tell me about that.
Thank you so much. Now we have Joe Reedy. Then this, I think, is our last question. Nice to see you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Anna. Vince, thanks so much for a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Here's just a quick commentary and a question embedded in it, realizing this is the last one. I'll try to make it brief. But one of the things that impressed me so much about your first chapter is the way that you took the broad space that you just described and the broad conceptual frameworks for analyzing that space that we historians commonly work with, whether we call it American slavery or whether we call it the Triangle Trade or the Atlantic Trade, whether we call it British or some other European nation's imperialism, or whether we call it capitalism in one variant or another. The critical element there is that individuals are interacting not with those broad concepts, but with smaller institutions that help to make those broader concepts what they are and to make them work. So when you have Wager in West Africa interacting with the Royal African Company and then things develop as they do, and then you have Wager with the Royal Navy, there are two institutions that in fact create the archives to some extent that you draw upon to understand the story. So what I'm suggesting is that you're bringing together the people who are the story with the institutions that create the records that we now have access to try to understand their story. So I don't think we'll ever, through those records, be able to get to all the African epistemological questions that are legitimate, but nonetheless, they tell a marvelous story about Wager working his way through these institutions, learning each step along the way, putting away pieces in his memory and in the practice as he interacts with other enslaved people to understand how the big system works, to find out where its weak points are, and ultimately, when the time is right, to rise up and revolt. You did a marvelous job with that.
Oh, thank you. I very much appreciate you saying that. I think the key kind of conceptual aid for me there was some work by an anthropologist named Timothy Ingold, who writes very interestingly about space. And kind of what he talks about is when he talks about regions, he says that regions are actually constituted by the itineraries of people who kind of narrate that space as they go, who find their way, right? So he doesn't think about a region as pre-existing the actual experience and itineraries and mapping strategies of the people who move through it. And so by kind of placing John Cope and Apongo and Arthur Forrest in that territory, I could actually write about the Atlantic region through their trajectories and tie everything together that way. And that for me became a kind of much richer way of really introducing the Triangle Trade, Atlantic Empire, the slave trade from Africa, African imperial politics through their experiences in a way that like made those regions inseparable, right? Once you kind of see their trajectories tracing through them, you can't understand this anymore without understanding that African history is fundamentally a part of American history, which is a part of European history, which is also a part of and integrated with African history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, I think that this was our last question. Then again, I would like to thank Vincent Brown for joining us today, and especially to thank also Jessica Johnson for co-hosting this first session. Thank you so much, Vince. And do not forget, then the book is here, and I think that the cover is not flipped. Then if you didn't read the book yet, go ahead, get the book, read it. And you are going to meet again on August 12th. And this is going to be to celebrate and to discuss the book Wicked Flesh by Jessica Johnson. It's her first book, and we are very happy to be able to host her to this second session of the Slavery Book Club, Slavery Archive Book Club, sorry. Then folks, I see you then soon and hope you enjoyed. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Stay healthy, stay strong, because we need to continue until the end of the year at least. Bye-bye.
This has been fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you
Good
so
night,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jessica. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vince.
Good night.